Yo, Beth. That shit crazy.
Welcome, everybody, to All Even Live exclusive. I am Barry Grant Jr., host of the All Even podcast. To my left is Mike Guido, host of Guido's Gridiron Blitz. Down at the bottom left is Matt Cataruzolo. And on the show that we have today, we have the talented, journalist. She writes for, the Wizards, the Mystics, the Washington football team. We have Carita Parks on the show. Welcome to the show. How you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, we got to start off by saying, how's your family? How's everything doing with this, this whole pandemic? Hope you're safe. Hope they're safe.
Yeah. I'm managing. I'm like trying to just lay low, stay out the way. My family's actually in Florida. That's where I'm originally from. So they're actually doing well, considering the fact that Florida's doing whatever they want during the pandemic.
Right.
They're surviving.
Yeah, definitely. So, let's go ahead and just kick it off. How did you get started in regards to, sports and journalism? Was it something that you've always wanted to aspire to do, or is it something that you kind of just fell into?
I have like a really interesting story in how I got into sports journalism. So my background is actually in public relations. That's what I went to school for. So, and that's really been the bulk of my career. And so I always aspired actually to do sports PR. And so professionally, I continue to just work, regular jobs or whatnot, which have been great. Don't get me wrong. They paid the bills. But on the side, I had my own consulting business in PR. So I started working with some sports clients. I worked with the Black Enterprise Golf and Tennis Weekend. When Super Bowl was in Florida at one point, I did some work with Super Bowl and also worked on Penny Hardaway's radio show. So all that was PR. And then I met someone during NBA draft weekend who had her own sports blog, and I started doing PR for her. And with that, I was on the PR side doing some events during Super Bowl in Phoenix. And that's when I kind of saw the journalism reporter side, because she had reporters there and I got to kind of hang out with them and see what they were doing. And in PR, you write. That's a big part of your job, is to write. So I already knew I was a good writer. I love sports. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to see if she'll let me do some writing. So it just started off as a little additional hobby. I'm going to write a little bit. Eventually, she was able to get me credentialed for the NFL draft. That was my first big event. So I did some reporting for the draft, and it's just really grown from there. I covered a few Super Bowls, and I was like, I want to focus more on local. And then that's kind of how I got into the Wizards and the Mystics and the Washington football team. And I just got linked up with a local outlet. And then eventually I started my own, which is Double Take Sports. Yeah. So it was kind of like a interesting journey, but here I am, and it's been great, and I absolutely love it.
Awesome. So what did you do to keep yourself busy? So last year, obviously, right, and I was with Sports Map Radio for the bulk of what was a period where there were no sports on. I still have the copy of the New York newspapers and everything like that when they, pretty much shut everything down. I'm always curious because I was working pretty heavily at that point. I was pretty lucky from that point on. But and you've been around in a bunch of different avenues and everything like that. How did you keep yourself busy? How did it affect your business?
Fortunately, I would say once at first, obviously for everyone, it just slowed down and nobody knew what was going on. Yeah. And I think for me, the good thing is I can kind of go back and forth between the journalism and the PR. So I did focus a little bit more on my PR. But eventually the sport started coming back. And while you couldn't necessarily be there in person, Zoom, especially with the NBA bubble and then the WNBA bubble, and I cover both sports, that kept me quite busy, because eventually they were playing at the same time and they were having their Zoom conferences at the same time. And then football season rolled around and like they did a lot of virtual with the draft and things of that nature. So once they started figuring it out, those media availabilities and Zooms kept me crazy busy. And then just keeping up with the games and writing my content. So it's really ironic. I still felt like I was busy, you know, like I said, once things started rolling again.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting thinking about just the whole Washington sports scene. I feel like when most people think about big sports cities, you know, it's New York, it's LA, it's even down in Houston, big sports city like that. I feel like Washington isn't really one of the first cities that comes to mind. As an insider now with all of your experience there in the nation's capital, what is how big of a sports scene across the NFL, the NBA, the WNBA, how really big is sports in Washington, D.C. itself?
Oh my gosh, it's huge. And I come from Jacksonville, Florida, right? So all we had was the Jacksonville Jaguars. No jokes, no jokes.
Such a shame.
We only had the Jacksonville Jaguars. So for me, when I moved here, I mean, this city has every sport. And don't get me wrong, you know, all the teams aren't necessarily great, but the fans still support these teams and they're still fanatics. So even when people were not going to the Washington football games, like fans, and they were showing the empty stadiums, there was still a huge uproar on social media. So like fans were still very much tapped in. But to me, this is a huge sports city, especially when the Capitals won the Stanley Cup.
Yeah.
And then not too long after that, you had the Nationals win the World Series. I mean, it was bananas. So I've loved it here. I think, especially as a journalist, there is a team to cover. And the Wizards, as well as the Washington football team, no matter what their record is, they're still being talked about. Like people talk about them no matter what. So I'm just fortunate. And how can I forget the Mystics? Like the Mystics also, they won the championship. So in a matter of a couple years, 3 major teams in this area won their respective championships. So
yeah, definitely.
It's like you said, it might not be the first to come to mind, but being here, I mean, it's huge. They've got everything.
Yeah, no, definitely. I definitely agree with that. You know, like Matt said, it's definitely a big city for sports. And I want to talk about, you know, the Washington Wizards a little bit. You know, we saw the turnover in regards to the big trade with John Wall and Russell Westbrook. Now, is there a different feel in regards to the team, you know, minus the record, but is there a different feel with the John Wall led, you know, Wizards, you know, and the Russell Westbrook led Wizards? Is there a difference in, because, you know, there was always some talk that the locker room was always a question mark for the, you know, the John Wall led Wizards. So do you see more of a calming force in that locker room, or is it still, you know, uncertainty and, you know, they're just going as they go, you know, going with the motions?
Yeah, you know, what I'll say is this. My experience, and I can only speak on my experience.
Right.
But my experience in covering the team, I never really picked up on that tension that the national media talked about when it came to Brad and John. I mean, they may not hang out every single day, like outside of the court, but I just never saw them having that tension that people tried, like the national media portrayed. And my experience covering John, he was one of my favorite guys to cover. Now, what I will say is maybe the difference between the Russell Westbrook-led Wizards and the John-led Wizards is Russell has more years in this league. And now the Washington Wizards are so young that those guys really like look up and respect Russell. You know, he's been an I think he's like a 9-time All-Star or something along those lines, but they really look up to him. So they respect what he says. And from a Bradley Beal perspective, it's the same thing. Like he respects Russell's time in the league. So I think that would really be the only difference is, I guess you could call Russell someone who has more of a mentor type leadership, whereas John was almost like their, you know, a peer.
Yeah.
Because they all pretty much had the same time in the league. Him and Brad played together, like growing up. So that's what I would say the biggest difference is.
Yeah, I feel like every day, maybe not every day, but every week or so, we're hearing, Bradley Beal should get shipped out somewhere so he can play for a contending team once in his life, like something along those lines. You being as close as you are, do you feel that Bradley Beal is bound to get moved at some point?
Maybe at some point, but I don't think that point is anytime soon. Before he signed his recent contract, the Wizards were not doing well. Brad made a choice, and this is what I always say. He made a choice to sign that contract, that new contract or the extension. He didn't have to do that. So I know everyone's like, oh, he deserves to be on a team that's contending. But he knew what he was getting himself into, and he's really big on loyalty. And one of the reasons that he signed that extension is he said he wants to be a part of this team's growth. And so I think he still sees something with the team. As you know, there's been some growing pains this season as far as their record is concerned, but he seems to still see something. He wants to be here. Also with Brad, you have to remember he has a family and he's really big on his family. And he's also talked about that. This is a great place for his family. So I think there's a lot of considerations that are going into his reasons for staying with the Wizards. Now, I think that if he doesn't see any progress, then eventually he may decide that this is not where he wants to be. But to me, it seems like he's willing to push through and see what happens. And I really think that played into the Russell Westbrook, John Wall trade. It's like they wanted to do what they thought would have them win now in order to secure and keep Bradley Beal. Like they're trying to build this team around him.
Yeah, especially now in the age of all this player mobility, you have all these superstars teaming up. We saw it in Los Angeles. We saw it this year in Brooklyn. It's tough. That can weigh a lot on a player who seems like they're under this immense amount of pressure, like Bradley Beal. Mm-hmm. And it was an interesting backcourt to try to invest their future in for the Washington Wizards with Wall and Beal. And now, Wall struggled with injuries, and then they shipped him off to Houston, and now we're left with what we have now. And I know everyone here has seen the memes of Bradley Beal on the bench. He's scoring 50, but they're still down by 20. So, it's an interesting dynamic what's happening right now with Washington and Bradley Beal. Do you think there might be any sort of or any amount of tension between Bradley and the organization from that kind of standpoint?
That is a good question. But here's what I will say. Just being a part of the post-media availabilities, Brad, he does have that demeanor on the bench, and I'm sure it's in the moment, and that's truly how he feels. But he has surprised me in the sense of every time after those tough games and we see him in those media availabilities, his attitude is still very positive. So I will say if there's tension between him and the organization, I'm not picking up on it. It's a little more difficult because I'm not in person the way I used to be, just because of the whole nature of everything going on with COVID. But from what I'm seeing from consistently covering the team, I'm not picking up on dissatisfaction. And that's something I don't think you can necessarily hide that in your demeanor or your attitude. And I haven't seen it. He's been surprisingly positive, to be honest, because sometimes I'm like, after some of these games, I'm expecting him to come in there like, what do y'all want to talk about?
Right.
But he's been fairly positive, so he's taking it pretty decently.
Definitely. Now, we're going to speak about general NBA stuff. Like, what is your biggest story in regards to the NBA this season? There's a lot of storylines going on about Brooklyn, about, Jokic being the MVP. There's a whole bunch of different, subplots and stuff like that going on. But what do you think is your biggest story or the biggest story in the NBA, in your opinion?
I think what you kind of mentioned, I think the Nets are a big story, right? Because they have KD now, they have Kyrie, they now have James Harden, and this is supposed to be like their little super team. So I think there's pressure on them to do well, and everybody's projecting that they'll go to the finals. So I think having that kind of pressure, especially when you put the team together that you put together, I believe everyone's looking to see how it plays out. So I'm going to stick with the Nets for right now. I mean, James Harden, I'll be honest, I'm a little tired of him after the whole Houston thing and like all that foolishness. But I think all eyes are still on Brooklyn of like, okay, are they going to be able to do this the way that everyone thought? Because, you know, they were the favorites coming into the season, and they've been okay so far. I mean, we'll see as the season goes, but yeah. Yeah,
you need a little bit of, I think what a lot of people were worried about is who is going to make the sacrifice, right? Like who is going to, you got three guys that need the ball pretty much at all times, and who's going to be the guy that sacrifices it. And it looks like that James Harden has kind of embraced the, you know, point guard distributor. He's that kind of a guy. Now, you even heard Kyrie Irving, who's been listed as a point guard his entire career, and James Harden has been listed as a shooting guard his entire career. James, you're the point guard. I'm the shooting guard. It's just, it's scary because you have so many guys that all do really similar things with the basketball and everything like that. They need it. Their usage rates are incredibly high, but it's that sacrifice that they've got where I think it's just working. Do you think that that's going to carry into later into the season, playoffs? Is the tension going to grow? What are your feelings about that?
That's interesting, right? Because when James Harden came into the mix, I saw all these like dumpster fire posts. Like they thought that was going to be like what, you know, set it all off. But to your point, they are surprisingly working it out and working well together. Will the tension grow over the season? I think that's to be determined. If they want to win, they're going to have to figure it out. And so if this is working, I think they're professional enough to know it's working. But then again, you just don't know, because Kyrie might decide he don't want to come to work again. Who knows? So I think but I think if they stay focused and continue to do what's working, that they'll be okay.
We've had this conversation. We've had this conversation on the podcast before, especially when the Harden trade went down. That there's this philosophy in sports, not just in basketball, that teams have a window, right? There's a certain timeline for where they can capitalize on their success, and in order to do that, sometimes you have to go all in, right? So Brooklyn realized that they have a championship window after acquiring KD and Kyrie. They said we need to capitalize, and we have a window for success, so let's pounce on it now. And I like to ask a lot of people if they agree with the philosophy that if you have a certain amount of time to capitalize on that sort of success, do you think it is worth sacrificing so many assets, sacrificing future picks, sacrificing bench depth to go so top heavy to create this super team to capitalize on that success? I'm curious to know if you agree or disagree with that philosophy.
I would say, like, unfortunately, that philosophy seems to be just what it is, because of the fact that some of those super teams in the past have worked. Like when you look at the Miami Heat, when they had LeBron, they had D Wade, and I can't remember who.
Bosh.
Chris Bosh.
Yes, there we go. Chris Bosh. How could I forget Chris Bosh?
He's always a forgotten one.
Right. And they got that championship, and we've seen this replicated throughout the league. I don't particularly like it. I don't really like building these super teams. I'm like, compete and make smart moves, obviously, but compete. But I think because this formula has worked in the past for some other teams, people are capitalizing on it, and they're making these super teams, and that's just kind of what we're dealing with right now. So I think as long as it keeps working, people are going to continue to do it.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that as well. Now, I definitely want to know your point or your take on this. Like, Draymond Green had came out, and talked about the double standard in the NBA that, when players want to get traded, they get vilified for it. The ownership doesn't. And, we've talked about this topic ad nauseum on our show, and there's no other league in the world that has more player control, or the players have more control than they have in the NBA. What are your thoughts about the double standard? Do you think that there is a double standard, and does it exist in your opinion?
I could agree with him on that. I definitely think there's a double standard. I mean, fans are always going to go for the athlete before they go for the organization. I think that argument is only an argument for those players who, like in the James Harden situation. I mean, to me, he should have been vilified because he was handling that
Agreed.
in a very
Yes.
unprofessional manner.
Right.
So I think when it comes to those kind of cases, which we have seen, that double standard, in my opinion, doesn't exist. But I do think that fans are going to automatically vilify the athlete, unfortunately, even when the organization may also be in the wrong. But then I don't know, like I see here and people like with that John Wall trade or you know, like people really went in on the organization. So I kind of just think it is where you like what organization you're dealing with and the situation. I don't think it's a double standard in every way.
Right.
I think with the particular situation he was talking about, I definitely can see that. And I'm sure as players, they're frustrated because they feel like they can't do things that the organization can do. So I can see his point. I don't totally disagree with it. I think it's situational.
Yeah, I think you're right in the way that you view it and viewing it in a very individualistic way, right? Because they're not all bad, they're not all good. And I certainly agree that there are instances where the organization could, theoretically handle things better, right? When Harrison Barnes got pulled off the bench and told that he was traded, and when DeMarcus Cousins got told during a press conference or something like that he was traded, like, yeah, you certainly should be able to communicate a little bit better than that. But another thing that Draymond Green was saying was that it feels like the athletes are getting a lot more backlash for what they do than organizations do. And what I was thinking is at the very same time, Draymond Green did say something that's backlash in itself. Okay. The people that were supporting Draymond Green in that sort of instance, I mean, I actually feel that now has like the support for players and the vilification of, I might have just made up a word, the vilification of organizations has never been greater. I think it's actually been more than it's ever been. What do you think about that?
The vilifying organizations versus the players.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't even say it's more or less, but in comparison to how organizations were looked at and how they're looked at now, I think that there's a lot more support for players than there used to be. Am I wrong?
No. I that's what I'm saying. I absolutely agree, especially when like fans gravitate towards those peyers.
Right.
You mentioned being in the middle of a game. Like I remember when Kelly Oubre got traded from the Wizards. Like that happened. So that whole trade was ridiculous. It happened like at the end of a game, and I remember it was very hard for like talking to the players. Like that took them. The players that were still here, that took them completely off guard. It's like I'm just playing with this guy, and we get off the court. And it's like, now he's traded, and the fans went off about that. And you see that. So it's, to my point, it's situational. There's some situations where the fans are going to vilify the organization as they should. And then there's situations where they're going to vilify the athlete, whether it's called for or not.
Yeah, there's definitely different situations that require different types of blame. When things happen, especially big bombshell storylines like a trade or a blockbuster trade happens, fans are going to be scrambling for reasons. They're going to be calling for somebody's head, whether it was fair or unfair. And I think that's a big effect to what like kind of the LeBron James effect has had on the rest of the NBA, of how he's empowered players with the whole more than an athlete movement, which is great. And I really like the direction that the NBA is heading in with giving players more power. And we talk about vilifying organizations rather than vilifying athletes in different situations. So do you think that this player empowerment is going to just continue to grow? And if so, do you think it's good for the NBA?
I think it will continue to grow, especially after dealing with this pandemic and all of the social injustices that were occurring. And I will say with the NBA, not as much as the WNBA, but with the NBA, they have, in my opinion, there's kind of always been, depending on the athlete, this like empowerment. I think it's grown now. Like LeBron has always been empowered, right? Like you got a Jordan, he's always going to be empowered. But now I think that we are seeing it spread, and I think the NBA is starting to embrace that. And I hope it continues because, and I do think some of that is a result of the pandemic. It's like they need the players actually to feel empowered and to also help with their messaging, right, during this time. So I hope that continues. I think it will continue to some degree. But once again, I think it still also depends on the player and like what they are doing.
Right. Now, you were down at the Super Bowl, correct?
I wasn't at the Super Bowl this year. I was covering the Super Bowl. So they had it really restricted because of COVID, but virtually.
Okay.
You were still able to cover it from virtual. So I was.
Were you shocked about how the game went? Did you actually think that it would go that way? Like, obviously, a lot of people thought that, Brady would have a chance to win. He's very comfortable in the Super Bowl. That's like his second home. But do you actually thought that, that would be a blowout? The way the game went, I think people are still shell shocked by the outcome.
I did not think it would be a blowout. I definitely thought it could go either way, because you can never, unfortunately, count Tom Brady out in a Super Bowl. And the Bucks, like, they just trended at the right time. They trended up at the right time. And so they had that momentum going into the Super Bowl. But I really thought it could go either way, because Patrick Mahomes, in my opinion, you can't count him out in any game either.
Right.
But I did not expect a blowout. I was really, really surprised that the Bucks handled the Chiefs like that. And I mean, shout out to Todd Bowles, shout out to him for coming up with that game plan that kept Patrick Mahomes and that whole offense at bay. I mean, they barely even got Tyreek Hill involved in that game.
Nothing.
So no, to answer your question, I did not think it would be a blowout. Thought it would be much closer than what it was. But if you really think about it, last year, the Chiefs actually didn't play well either in the Super Bowl. It's just that the 49ers like blew that lead and couldn't.
That's fair. That's fair. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's have a tad bit of an uncomfortable conversation. Just a little bit. Just a tad bit. Okay. It's not quite as bad as deciding whether Uncut Gems is a good movie or not, but it's still pretty uncomfortable.
It's a good movie.
Washington football team.
Yes.
Or as they are now called, the Washington football team, right?
Yes.
So big controversy, name change.
Mm-hmm.
An entire demographic of people came forward and said, hey, listen, calling it Washington Redskins is even though, again, they were called that for 100 years, since the 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
It's, really looking down on our people. Like, this is really not something that we want here.
Right.
Really controversial. I get it. I have a feeling, I have a bit of a theory that they're going to stick with Washington football team as kind of an FU to the NFL a little bit. I have a theory about that. What are your thoughts on that whole name change conversation?
So the reason that they didn't change the name is because, as you know, the owner, Dan Snyder, he refused to do so.
Yeah.
But in my opinion, what really happened and what really forced his hand is because at that time we were at the height of like the George Floyd situation and all the protests. So companies, they had to pretty much put their money where their mouth was if they didn't want to look bad just in general, and not with the Washington football team, but with just anything that had to do with any type of racial injustice. So you have FedEx threaten to drop off as a sponsor. Yeah. You had Walmart take their merchandise off the website. You had Amazon do the same thing. So really what happened is they were hitting the pockets of the organization.
Exactly.
And that got Dan Snyder's attention. And so the name has changed. Now, I think that it would have been better if he would have voluntarily did it a long time ago, but I think it's a positive change. There's some people who are really upset about it still, but at the end of the day, it offended quite a few people, and it's just like, change the name. As far as the Washington football team, I don't disagree. I would not be surprised if they keep that name. I don't know if I have the same theory about why they would keep the name as far as the NFL is concerned. The reason I think they may keep it is because I've seen them invest too much. Like the stadium, they had Washington football team like on the seats at the facility where they practice. they actually put the name up on the building. I mean, that costs money. And like I told you in the beginning, I'm in PR. You're not going to do all of that. In my opinion, you're not putting that brand on absolutely everything like that for it to be temporary. So I don't know, they may change it, but I haven't heard anything about, well, I know they said through the next season, it'll probably still be the Washington football team, but I don't know, guys. I don't know if that's changing.
It's fun to say.
It is.
Washington football team. Like, I don't know. It's fun.
Feels like the 1930s, man.
I mean, the Washington football team went to the playoffs like this
They
year.
did.
So
They did.
keep
Unbelievable.
that energy going.
Ay.
Yeah, the whole Washington football team season, I think this year was a roller coaster. I mean, going into it, you had so many questions. There were a lot of reasons not to really be very high on it. There was the whole name change. Trent Williams goes to the 49ers. A couple weeks into the season, they cut Dwayne Haskins. There's so many things, there's so many questions surrounding the football team that doesn't really give the fan base a whole lot of confidence. You fast forward to the end of the season. Ron Rivera gets that locker room whipped into shape. Ron Rivera beats cancer. A great story. Alex Smith wins Comeback Player of the Year. Chase Young emerges as an absolute star. I'm a Giants fan. It really hurts seeing Chase Young in a Washington football team uniform. But then you have all these reasons to be excited. So what's kind of the overall what was kind of the overall shift from fan base confidence from the beginning of this season to this point after seeing them go to the playoffs?
Going to the playoffs. I mean, that's just like, and I'm just going to be honest, like once fans started to see that them winning and they went to the playoffs, it's like all of a sudden, you know, they were bought in. And that's really what needed to happen anyway. It's like, so in order to a fan base that felt the way that they felt about the team in the beginning of the season, like that's really the only way you can prove that you're different is to win. But not only that, we started to see evidence of the culture shift, right? Like you said, Ron Rivera beating cancer, being on the sidelines even while having cancer, and you're seeing that rubbing off on the team and just the way that they play and the way they approach things. Darius Geis, when he got into his issue, like Ron Rivera cut that off immediately. There was no playing around. So you just started to see the action from a culture perspective, and then you also started to see the results on the field. And I really think that is what, those two things together is what got the fans rallying back around the team.
Yeah, definitely. You know, just sticking with the Washington football team for a little bit. I mean, you know, the team on the field got it together, like you said at the end. You know, they galvanized. You know, they made the playoffs. They were tough out. You know, they played the Bucks tough. My issue with the Washington football team is actually in the front office. Now, we had a lot of, you know, allegations of harassment and stuff like that. You know, as a journalist, you know, as a woman journalist, like, you know, how does it feel to have to, you know, cover such a shady, you know, black cloud over this organization that has, you know, it's been lingering for a lot of years now, uncovered, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it is. Here's what I'll say. It's tough as a woman, and even as a woman of color, because with the whole name and everything.
Right.
So it can be tough from that perspective, just the human side of it. But then at the same time, from a journalist side, I still have a job to do, right? So I have to put that hat on as well. And so my job is to cover the team. It is not to be biased. You know, if I see something that doesn't sit right, then like that's what it is. But at the end of the day, I still have to do a job. I still have to report on those players, still report on the games, report the good things that I see. But like I said, also point out the things that may not line up. So I would say more so from just a human perspective, definitely. But I will say this, and this is kind of what I was saying earlier. As time went on, we started to see changes, right? They hired a president, only Black president in the NFL, over an NFL team. They hired Julie Donaldson, the first woman to host a radio broadcast in the NFL. We saw like with Ron Rivera. So they started to do things and put things in place that look better. So I will say I'm not looking at the past. I'm going to focus on what they are doing right. And it looks to me like they're trying to right their wrongs, but consistency is key, right? So we have to continue to see that moving forward.
Right.
So that's what I'll say.
So I always think that that's an interesting conversation to have, because I wonder if, like, I've always been curious of, like, what is the line of which we can say, okay, we're cool, right? Like a team that's had a troubling, or at least a troubling, at least recent history, right?
Yeah.
Like a troubling recent history, that at what point do we say, okay, they've done this, they've done that, okay, we're cool? Like, what do you need to see? What are the specific things that you need to see in order for you to qualify them as, okay, they're trying?
Yeah, well, that kind of just ties back to what I said, the consistency of it all. I think like some of those things that I named are actual, like they're getting the front office together. And they made some additional good decisions in the offseason by, hiring Jennifer King on full time. And they got a new general manager. So they seem to be putting the right people in place. And I do think that with any organization, it really does start at the top, right? So just continuing to see that, continuing to see good decisions from a coaching perspective and a personnel perspective. I think coming up in the draft, like, how are they going to handle those holes that they currently have? What are they going to really do about the quarterback situation? Because Heineke, he was great, but I don't think he's necessarily the long-term solution. So what are you going to do about that? So just continuing to see them make good decisions, but then those decisions also like continuing to show on the field and them continuing to win and just having a better culture. But over time, not just this season
Right.
or next season. So,
all right. Carita, we know you got to bounce. So last question before we ask everybody that we interview this exact same question. Who in your mind is the greatest athlete of all time in any sport?
Ooh, of all time in any sport. Man, I have to
goat
go
of goats.
Mike, get the tally out, man. Get the book out. Get the book out.
I'm probably saying something that's like not really that surprising, but I mean, obviously Michael Jordan, in my opinion, I mean, he is the GOAT of goats. His personality, but a lot of those guys who are great, like they're not necessarily nice. Like that's why they are who they are. And I just really, what I do like about him though, is he can find the smallest thing to be motivation, like the smallest thing. Like you may have not even meant anything by, like, I don't know, maybe you just said, oh, you played okay today.
Or hello.
Right. You know what I mean? And he's like, oh, I played okay. And like in his mind, he's got that like checked off, like, okay, I'm gonna show that person.
But that personally.
That person are like moving along with your life and don't even making that comment. So MJ, I'm gonna go with MJ. Definitely.
You are the first MJ.
Really? So
you are the first MJ that we've gotten.
Give her the answers, Mike.
We've gotten some surprising answers.
So we've gotten incredibly surprising answers. So Diego Maradona, we've got Muhammad Ali.
Okay.
We have Randy Moss. We have Peyton Manning.
Interesting.
And we have Edwin Moses.
Interesting. Well, I like my answer.
And now
we have Michael Jordan.
That's all right. Stick with your answer, Carita. That's fine. That's fine. Well, listen, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you for coming on. You can tell everybody where they can find you, where what you have going on in the future.
Yes. So you can find me, like I mentioned earlier, I have my own platform. It's called Double Take Sports. So it's at DBL Take Sports. I'll continue to cover the Wizards. So you can find that work on another platform. It's called Sports Journey. I'll be covering the Washington football team again, and obviously the Mystics as well. So it'll be busy coming up, but I love it. So also follow me on my personal accounts. That's at Carita C. Parks. That's on all platforms as well. And that's where you can find all of my work actually. So
definitely.
Excellent.
So now, this was great. Thank you for coming on. Hopefully we have you again at some time, down the road. I'm Barrington Grant, host of the All Even podcast. That is Mike Guido of Guido's Gridiron Blitz. We have Matt Cataruzolo down the bottom, and we'll see you guys next week.